Well, this morning we're continuing on in John chapter 20. Now, in 1970, many of you probably have not seen this. Actually, in 1970, if you were an Assemblies of God person and you went to a movie, you were in problem. You have trouble. But in 1970, a small, low-budget movie was released called Hercules in New York. Now, you might remember this movie. It's tremendous. It's stupendous. It's fun. Is what it says, Hercules in New York. And it starred Arnold Stang, who I have never heard of. Granted, I mean, it came out 6 years before I was born, and so that's a good reason. And then the other star was Arnold Strong. Arnold Strong. What an interesting name. Arnold Strong, a little-known actor, because this was his very first movie that this actor made. Arnold Strong. He was difficult to understand. He had a hard last name to pronounce. And so in 1968, Arnold actually started a mail order business of supplements and supplies. And so they went to Arnold Strong for his last name. But when he hit it big, and started getting more recognition, and when the VHS tape came out, how many of you remember your first VCR at home? Your first VCR. I remember my first VCR at home. You know what the first movie we watched at home? I can tell you the first movie we watched on the VCR at home. And it had a remote. It had a remote with a 20-foot cord. Right? You remember this? Yeah. So the first movie we watched when we went down to Videotown to rent a movie, right? Because prior to that, you would go down to rent laser discs, right? So we went down and we rented The Rats and Nim. Does anybody remember this? Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats and Nim, right? The Secret of Nim is what it was. That's what the first. But when Hercules in New York was released on VHS tape, Arnold Strong had hit it big, and they changed their marketing. They changed their cover. Hercules in New York was now, go ahead and go to the next slide there. It was now Arnold Schwarzenegger was who Hercules in New York was. And let me tell you how bad Hercules in New York was. You should YouTube it, okay? It's horrible. I mean, it's bad. It's really basically just opportunities for Arnold Schwarzenegger to take his shirt off and just flex. That's what it is. But it was so bad they actually dubbed his voice. And so you can find the dubbed or the undubbed version. And now, so actually, that's like what it says. It says featuring Arnold's original audio track because no one could understand them, right? And so, but Schwarzenegger is a very interesting person. I don't know if you've ever really looked at the career of Arnold Schwarzenegger or why he's popular. Here he is. He's 71 years old now. He's 71 years old. And he's still in really good shape. But, oftentimes people, they remember Arnold for his movies because all of those are just Oscar-worthy endeavors. I mean, right, we all remember Twins. That's classic right there, right? Right, yeah. Some of his movies are but Kindergarten Cop, I mean, we all remember, right? Kindergarten Cop, it's not a tumor, right? We got, but what really made Arnold popular was his bodybuilding, and these are his awards as a bodybuilder. 1965, Junior Mr. Europe, he was Mr. Universe 5 times. I'm not more than 5 times. He was Mr. Universe 7 times. He was Mr. Olympia. What? 1970 to 75, 1980, 1969. So 7 times he was Mr. Olympia. Mr. Olympia, that's a big deal. Arnold Schwarzenegger still holds the record for the largest chest in competition at 58 inches. That's big. That's big, 58-inch chest. Muscle. He was known for his weightlifting. It wasn't really his acting. His counterpart, his contemporary was Lou Ferrigno, who we all know from The Incredible Hulk, right? Lou Ferrigno and Arnold Schwarzenegger actually were in competition for that position, but no one could understand Arnold, so Lou Ferrigno got it. Phenomenal. But Arnold Schwarzenegger, he was inspired in the early 60s to become a bodybuilder when he met Austria's leading bodybuilder, and his soccer coach encouraged him to start weightlifting, and that became his driving factor, his driving force. He loved working out, and he saw it as his way to become successful. And he did. He did. He was very successful as a bodybuilder in that. Actually, Arnold Schwarzenegger, he gives. Okay, I know we give Arnold a hard time because his movies are pretty bad. Most of them, not all of them. But Arnold Schwarzenegger has some really interesting quotes on success. And he has been very successful. Beyond just bodybuilding and beyond the movies, he also has been a very successful real estate tycoon. He has invested in millions and millions of dollars worth of real estate. He was the governor of the third largest economy in the world. That's amazing, when he was the governor of California. Now, if you remember, just right around the time he became governor, there was a little movie that came out with not Arnold Schwarzenegger, it came out with Sylvester Stallone, Demolition Man. Again, not a good movie. I'm not recommending you go see it. But there's a joke in that movie that Arnold was so popular that Congress changed the law about being president. So somebody that was foreign born could become president, and Schwarzenegger was now the president of the United States. That's how popular he was. But Arnold Schwarzenegger is actually a very successful person. And this is a great quote from him. It says, "You can't climb the ladder of success with your hands in your pockets." With your hands in your pockets. Arnold Schwarzenegger, in many ways, is kind of the epitome of a self-made man. Worked hard. And if you read his history, his career, he is a hard-working guy. Hard-working. And as I was reading John chapter 20, it seems unlikely that you would think of Arnold Schwarzenegger when you're reading the Bible. And I actually didn't really think about him, but the way the message shaped out, Schwarzenegger became a wonderful example for us to look at. And so I want you to look at John chapter 20. This is Jesus has been crucified. He's been buried. That's where we finished last week. Crucified, buried, in the tomb. And Jesus, where we're going to pick up in verse 11, has been resurrected. The tomb is empty. The tomb is no longer has Jesus there. And when we pick up verse 11, John chapter 20 is very interesting because there's a lot of ways we could go in John chapter 20. Because there's a lot. It's a theologically dense chapter. Because in John chapter 20, think of the significance of this. And this isn't the message, but think of the significance of this. The first person that Jesus appears to is a woman, which in today's day and age, we don't think much of. But back in biblical times, women weren't highly valued. When it says, Jesus fed 5,000, you understand that they're just counting the men, right? That doesn't include women and children. So Jesus first appears to somebody that society of the day did not highly value. Now, we could preach that, but we're not going to preach that today. But we've also preached, you could also probably have heard, how many of you heard messages on doubting Thomas, right? Because that's the end and the effect of doubt on our faith. We could preach that too, but that's not what we're going to preach either. What we're preaching either. So, but I want to look at two figures that we see in John chapter 20. We're going to pick up in verse 11. It says, "Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, 'Woman, why are you crying?' 'They have taken my Lord away,' she said, 'and I do not know where they have put him.'" She assumed they had stolen the body. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned to him and cried in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father, your Father, to my God, your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. Jesus appears to Mary, and as soon as she sees him, what does she say? "Teacher." She recognized him immediately, and she believed it was him immediately. And when we look at verse 24, we see a different response, don't we? Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hand and my fingers where the nails are, and put my hands into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." You know, that's one of those little miracles that we sometimes forget. There's a reason it says the doors were locked and Jesus appeared. That's a miracle, isn't it? But we read right through that and we go, okay, so yeah, sure. It's amazing. Those are just those little things that when I read Scripture, I'm just like, man, how easy is it for us to miss the little miracles like, you know, walking through walls, just appearing. We can take those things for granted. It's amazing to me what Jesus does in that moment because he knows what Thomas said. "Peace be with you." Verse 27. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Jesus said to him, "My Lord, my God." Then Jesus said, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." This morning, I've got a question for you. Who do you want to be? Do you want to be Mary Magdalene or do you want to be Thomas? Do you want to be Mary Magdalene or do you want to be Thomas? Now, both of them were blessed, weren't they? But Mary was more blessed because she believed, but she didn't question it, did she? They both saw him, but what did Thomas do? Thomas went, I don't really think. Until I see this, I'm not going to believe it. Who do you want to be? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Who do you want to be? What do you want to do if you want to be somebody else? When I was reading John chapter 20, that was the thought that came to my mind as I was reading it, because I saw the differences between Mary and Thomas. What do you do when you want to be somebody else? Have you ever had that moment where you woke up and said, "Man, I wish I was somebody different. I wish my life was different. I wish I could do something else. I don't really like who I am." Arnold Schwarzenegger, this is not a sermon by Arnold Schwarzenegger, in case you're curious, has an interesting quote. It says, "Who do you want to be?" And here's what he says. It says, "Figure out what makes you happy, no matter how crazy it may sound to others, and do that." That seems like pretty good advice, doesn't it? Who do you want to be? Find out what makes you happy, no matter how crazy it sounds, and do that. I don't know. Does that sound like good advice to you? It does sometimes. You know, here's the interesting world that we live in. If you want to learn how to do something, there's a resource there to do it. You know, just Google self-help videos. Look on YouTube. There's 1.1 million self-help videos on YouTube. Has anyone ever used YouTube to learn how to do something new? I didn't know how to charge my air conditioner in Heather's car. YouTube taught me how to do it. I'm pretty sure I could build an airplane and test your faith to see who would try it first. I haven't gotten that pilot's license yet. I haven't got that pilot's lesson, although we have it. I've got to go to D.C. and do that. If you want to do something, There's plenty of places to learn how to do it, right? And if what Arnold Schwarzenegger says is if you want to do something, you want to be something, you want to be somebody else, all you have to do is put your mind to it. Put your mind to it. When I was in my doctoral program, one of my professors, he was talking about those that plagiarize their dissertation. He says, if you want to be called doctor, just start calling yourself doctor. If you're not going to do the work, just start calling yourself doctor. No one's going to check. Unless you're running for Congress in Florida, which is what happened to that gal that claimed she had a degree from Miami of Ohio. They found out that it was fake. If you're going to fake a degree, which I don't encourage you to do, at least make sure it's a degree the school offers. And so, because Miami of Ohio said, no, we don't even offer that degree. And so, the thing is, in today's society and culture, it says if you want to be somebody, just put your mind to it. Just work hard. Just try your best. Do all that you can do. You know, the danger that we run into is that we're going to eventually see a book like this from Tony Robbins called The Self-Help Gospel. Now, this is not an actual book. I photoshopped that. But it's the danger that we run into oftentimes in churches today. That we see the gospel just as an opportunity to improve ourselves. Or just to speak to a specific situation. You know, I was reading an article yesterday on biblical literacy. It's at an all-time low in the American church. Because most people don't actually read their Bible. What a lot of people do anymore is they just search their situation on their phone. How can the Bible encourage me today? And they just search it. They don't study it. They don't read it. You know, when John says, eat this book, they don't eat the book. It's like they're going through a buffet, just picking out the pieces they want. That's the danger of today's society and culture that says you can be anything you want to be. You can be anybody you want to be. All you have to do is put your mind to it, and you can change who you are. The self-help gospel. It's not just about self-improvement, is it? It's not just about self-improvement. You know, Soren Kierkegaard, he was a philosopher, has one of my favorite quotes. You'll see it periodically on my social media. It says, now with God's help, I shall become myself. Now with God's help, I shall become myself. You know, we've talked about a number of people in the Bible in this last year as we've gone through John. We talked about different people. And you know, when we preached about Peter, I got a lot of messages of people saying that I think I'm like Peter, but I really want to be like this person. I want to do this, I want to do that. You know, life isn't really about being somebody else. It's about being who God created you to be. There are wonderful examples of biblical successes and biblical failures. There are examples that we do want to follow and examples that we don't want to follow. But when we read the Old Testament, we see some Old Testament heroes. We say, oh, that's a powerful life that I want to emulate. Although they fail a little bit. Or maybe we read biographies. Through the Gates of Splendor. Has anybody ever read Through the Gates of Splendor with Jim Elliot? Powerful book, isn't it? Powerful book. And I hear people, I want to be like Jim Elliot. I want to be like Billy Graham. I want to be like this. I don't want you to be that person. I want you to be the person God's created you to be. And Jesus' desire is not for you to be anybody, but who he has created you to be. When I look at the two examples in John chapter 20 between Mary Magdalene or Thomas, we often look at them and say, how can I do this? How can I do that? We say, how can I improve myself? And we think of how we're going to do something to change who we are. But Kierkegaard has got it, hit right on top of the head. Now with God's help, I shall become myself. You know, the Christian life is not really a life of self-improvement. It's not a life of trying harder. It's not a life of just trying to be good. I think one of the things we have to remember is that the Christian life is a life of self-denial. I must become smaller and you must become greater. Because as we allow Christ to become greater in our lives are transformed. But there's a few things that we have to remember in order to allow this to happen. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, you can turn there if you want, or I'll just read it to you. Verse 19. It says, "Do you not know that your bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." The first thing that we have to remember in the Christian life is this, that you are not your own master. You are not your own master, but you belong to God. If you don't belong to yourself, boy, you're going to start asking the owner, what would you like me to do? Because, if you don't own a car next door to you, but you take it, that's called stealing. That will get you in trouble. But oftentimes we still think that we belong to ourselves. But when we accept Christ as our Savior and our Lord, what we are doing is saying, I give myself to you. I turn over the ownership of me to you. I used to belong into the Royal Rangers. Royal Rangers had has a ministry called FCF. The Frontiersman Camping Fellowship. It used to be called Fraternity, and then some people got in trouble, so they changed the name to Fellowship. Okay, at church, we fellowship anything. Church is the only place that uses the word fellowship, right? Everyone else just calls it hanging out. We're together, right? But Frontiersman Camping Fellowship, they camp in the pre-1840 style, so no gas stoves, no electricity. We do let people use coolers because we didn't want them to get sick from food. But we do things pre-1840. And I enjoyed that. But what I really enjoyed when Royal Rangers has another ministry that is not nearly as well known, is called Chi Omega Rho. Chi Omega Rho is the college ministry of Royal Rangers, and it is a medieval fighting group. And so in my office, I have a helmet. It is a medieval helmet. I should have brought it. That I made, that I used to use to fight in. We would take PVC pipe, wrap it in pipe insulation and duct tape, and we would beat each other. It's fun. It's fun. How many of you have ever thought to yourself for a minute, though, I was born in the wrong era? I should have been born. How many of you Downton Abbey people think I should have been born in there, or Victorian times, or should have been? I think if I had been in the medieval times, I think I would have probably done okay. I enjoy the sword fighting. I really do. Now, it's not nearly as dangerous when you have pipe insulation and duct tape, because while I have broken fingers, I have never lost a limb. But we've all had that moment where we thought, I was born at the wrong time. But really, I think those thoughts are born out of this idea that you haven't really found what God's called you to. Because none of you were born at the wrong time. None of us were born at the wrong season. We were born exactly when God called us to be born. We're here in a place that God has called us to be. You're at Calvary Lighthouse because God has called you here, even if it's your first time. God has divine appointments for us left and right. And when we accept Christ as our Savior, when we start looking at how our life could be different, the first thing that we need to understand is that our life is not our own. Our life belongs to Jesus. And so if we desire to be somebody different than we are, what is the first thing that we should do? We should probably consult the owner to say, God, who would you have me become? Who would you have me to be? Because the reality is, it's by Jesus' sovereignty that we become more. On our own, we can improve ourselves somewhat. We can learn a new skill. We can improve our personality. We can learn how to interact with other people. There's all sorts of things we can learn. But true transformation only occurs when Jesus touches our life. You know, in John chapter 10, verse 10, if you remember what Jesus said there, it says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." You know, sometimes when we think about giving Jesus more of our lives, we worry about, will it be better than I could have done on my own? Because many of us grew up in a religious tradition that was restrictive, that was based on rules and guidelines. I know I've asked this question before, but about 80% of our church grew up Catholic. Catholics are good at rules, aren't they? Don't do this, do that. You know, it's pretty much don't do anything, just do this, right? There's all sorts of rules. And maybe you grew up, hey, anybody grew up in a Pentecostal holiness movement? Pentecostal holiness can be just as bad as any other group. Women aren't allowed to have skirts above their ankles, no makeup. It's interesting, all the holiness rules always apply to women. It's not so much the guys, right? You know, it's mainly to the women. It's control the women folk, because they're all going crazy, apparently. No, But those rules, they create restrictions in our mind, and they cause us to fear being controlled. But what Jesus said is, I have come that they might have life and have it to the fullest. The reality is, we cannot have the full life that Jesus desires for us apart from him. We can have a decent life. You say, well, you know, maybe I might be able to have a different career. I might be able to have more money. I might have this. Maybe. But, you know, there's successful people that struggle all the time. I think of Robin Williams. Robin Williams, successful movie career, successful comedian, millions of dollars, committed suicide, struggled with depression. Apart from Jesus, we have no hope. Live a full life. We live fully alive when we start to understand who Jesus has called us to be. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. I forgot to mark it. 1 Peter chapter 2. Verses 21 to 25. Here's what it says. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls. What does it say in verse 21? To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example. If we're going to emulate anyone, Christ alone is our example. Christ alone is our example. And they crucified him. It's not about just self-improvement. It's about finding who Jesus has called us to be. 1 Peter 2:21 is so powerful. But I want us to understand, it's not just a matter of be yourself or be the best version of yourself. It's about being who God created you to be. You know, Mark Hamill, many of you know I'm a Star Wars fan, big fan. Mark Hamill tweeted this week. Somebody, I don't know if you're on Twitter or not. Like 5 of us are still there. But Mark Hamill, somebody tweeted Mark Hamill. Mark Hamill's very witty. He's very funny. Somebody tweeted him and said, hey, Hamill himself, absolutely love your work, but your wit is something I strive for daily. Every time I hear something ridiculous, I ask myself, how would Mark Hamill respond? I wish you had t-shirts saying, what would Mark Hamill say? Fans would definitely wear it with pride. Here's what Mark Hamill said. Arnold Schwarzenegger asked me for advice when he was just starting out. I told him to lose the accent for a wider range of roles and to change his last name since no one could ever pronounce it. He did the exact opposite and became one of the biggest stars ever. Other people have plans for your life. They're going to tell you what to do. And in the 70s, Mark Hamill was a bigger star than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I can't say that that's true today. Other people have plans for your life. But what they say to do doesn't really matter much if it doesn't line up with who Jesus has called you to be. Who has Jesus called you to be? As I was preparing this week, Hebrews chapter 11 came into mind in this idea of how do we become who Jesus has called us to be. And it's very simple. It's by faith that we move into who God has called us to be. If you haven't read Hebrews 11, and we're doing a study on Wednesday nights in Hebrews, I'd invite you to join us. Hebrews, it's a letter to the Hebrews. Nondescript, we're not sure which Hebrews, we believe in Rome. But Hebrews actually reads a little bit more like a sermon than a letter. And to get this understanding of it is by faith that we become who Christ has called us to be, I wanted to read Hebrews chapter 11. Because I don't think there's any better preacher than the Bible. So strap on your listening ears and let's look at Hebrews chapter 11. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offering. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, that he rewards those who eagerly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking around to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was unable to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living when they died, were living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God was not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He embraced the promise, was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to the future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace from the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptian tried to do so, they drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to talk about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Japheth, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, even chains and imprisonments. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. They were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Verse 40, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together we would be made perfect. God has planned something better for us. It is by faith that we become who God has called us to be. And when we read the scriptures, we see Mary Magdalene and we see Thomas. We say, I want to be like them. I want to be like them. They are good examples for us to understand. But our real desire of faith is this. Who has Jesus called you to be? Put the faith in him, the faith of the ancients that we read about there, that he will show it to you, that he will reveal it to you. Life fully alive is when we give up control of what we think we should do, and we allow Jesus to shape us and mold us. It is what allows people to respond to the call of God, to put them in the most dangerous of situations. It is that responding to the call that God has put on us that allows us to move into places that we would not go on our own. If we were given our druthers, what would we do? We would stay where we were comfortable, we were warm, we were happy, we were wealthy. That's what we would do. But that might not be what Jesus has called you to. The question is, by faith, who is Jesus calling you to be, and how will you respond? Because he has told us time and time again, his ways are above our ways. His thoughts are above our thoughts. And the only way we become who God has called us to be is living a life of faith that says, Lord, here am I. Use me.